Okay, today we're going to add notes about different shapes into your notebook. When we are done with this, you can fold it in half, write shapes on the outside, and glue it into your notebook. The reason we need this is we are going to move on to a skill where we're going to graph points. It'll create a shape, and your job is going to be to identify the shape. Now we generally know triangles, squares, that sort of thing, but we're going to have to be really specific about the qualities that we see on each one of these. So we want to make sure we know all of those things. Some you might not. We will start with the triangles. If we have triangles that do not have any congruent sides, that is here, that's called scalene. The next one is two congruent sides and two congruent angles. You'll notice up here that we do have a little bit of a problem. It cut off some of the writing, so please write also two congruent angles here. Yours will fit a little better. It's hard to write on the iPad as I'm making this. And we will note on that one, the two congruent sides are here. Okay, and then two congruent angles. This angle is the same as this angle. Remember, we marked the arc with the little dash in it. And that triangle is called isosceles. Okay, again, do a better job of writing smaller. Don't really overlap the triangles, but I'm going to erase that now, so I'm going to give you a second to copy down the word isosceles and scalene and make sure your markings are correct, and then I'm going to erase here so that you'll be able to see my next stuff. Okay, let's move on to three congruent sides, and that should also say three congruent angles. So three congruent angles. Add that on. Okay, and let's do our markings. So this right here, we've got three congruent sides and three congruent angles. And that is called equilateral. Okay, again, pause if you need to write that down. I'm going to erase it now. Okay, next moving on to our bottom two triangles. What's important to note here is that they have right angles. Okay, you cannot assume that. It must be marked. This is called right scalene. And that is because it does have the right angle, and so it's important to note that it's a right triangle, but none of the sides are the same. So it's a scalene like the one above it. Okay, whereas this one right here, these two sides are the same, so not only is it a right triangle, but it also has two congruent sides. That means it's isosceles. So we would call this right isosceles. And because it's isosceles, we noted above that we have to have two congruent angles, so those two angles there are congruent. Okay, let's move along down lower to the other category. Okay, this, hopefully you know the name of this. Nothing special here. That's a circle. Okay, this right here, this has 5 sides. They are all congruent, so we can mark it this way. That is called a pentagon, and when all of the sides are the same, we call it a regular shape. So that is a regular pentagon. Okay, you write yours smaller. You can even write it inside if you want. That is a regular pentagon. Okay, I'm going to erase here because I want to be able to mark on the other figure. Okay, this one, again, all of the sides are the same, so that would be called regular. But there are 6 sides, so a 6-sided figure is called a hexagon. So we wouldn't want to just call this a hexagon. We want to be particular about it, so we say it's a regular hexagon. All right, get some of that stuff out of my way here. Okay, over here on our 4-sided figures, this up here, excuse me, up here has 4 sides, so it is called a quadrilateral. Sorry, I had to continue it there. Quadrilateral. Any shape with 4 sides is called a quadrilateral. What we want to look at is what specifics are there on a quadrilateral. So the first one, everything on the left here, these are all considered parallelograms. Okay, but we get more specific as we go downwards. So the first one, this is a parallelogram. Parallelogram means that those sides are parallel, and that marking there, that kind of little, it almost looks like an inequality shape, means parallel. So those sides there are parallel, and then those sides there are parallel. We have to do 2 markings because we want to make sure and show, so I'm going to even use a different color for that. We want to show these pink sides are parallel, but they are not parallel to the sides that I marked in black. Now, since we don't always have different colors, that's why on one set we'll use 1 marking and on the next set double. So that is what makes a parallelogram, and we can tell parallel sides on a graph by having the same slope. So that's what the tool is that we are going to use in the future, is we will know it's a parallelogram because we'll be able to look at the slope. I spelled parallel wrong. Okay, so now let's move on to the next figure, this one here. It is also a parallelogram, but then we get more specific. This side is congruent to this side, and this side, and this side. So all 4 sides are congruent there. Yes, it's a parallelogram still, but since all the sides are congruent, it gets more specific. This is called a rhombus. Okay, get that written down. Pause if you need to. Okay, moving on to our next one. These sides are congruent, but they are not congruent to the other 2 sides. Okay, so it's separate sets. And very different from the previous ones, we also have 4 right angles in the corner. That would need to be proven. You can't just look and say, oh, those are right angles. You would have to prove that. And that is called a rectangle. Okay, in order to say a shape is a rectangle, we would have to prove all of these things. Okay, and our next one, we still have the right angles, but this time all the sides are congruent. So it's kind of a combination of the rectangle's property of the right angles and the rhombus's property of 4 congruent sides. And we know that that shape is called a square. All right, moving on to the right-hand side, we have our non-parallelograms. The first 2, both of these right here, they are trapezoids. And what makes something a trapezoid is that it has only 1 set of parallel sides. So the parallelogram over here, it had 2 sets, the pink set and the black set, 2 different sets of parallel sides. On the trapezoid, we have just the 1 set. Okay, these sides here, those are not parallel to each other. So that is what makes it a trapezoid. Now, this next shape, it does have the 1 set of parallel sides. Okay, so it is a trapezoid, but it has an extra special feature. If you look at these slanted sides, they're not parallel. If they were, it would be a parallelogram, but they are congruent. Okay, and so when we have 2 congruent sides, just like on the triangle, we call that isosceles. And so this is an isosceles trapezoid. Oh, it won't let me write the S over. Oh, there we go. And just like on an isosceles triangle, we do have 2 congruent sides, and we also have 2 congruent angles. So those angles right there are congruent. Okay, and finally, we have the last shape. The property is that those 2 sides are congruent, and these 2 sides are congruent. Okay, and we call this a kite. Okay, make sure you have all of those markings and names. You can rewind the video if you need to. And then, like I said, go ahead and fold that in half and glue it into your notebook.